Okay. Well, thank you, Lillian, and thank you all for joining. Tonight, we're going to, this I think is going to be a real treat. This is a little time capsule of our church in the year 1954, and we're going to get acquainted with our settled minister at that time, John Nicholls Booth, who was with us for 8 years in the 1950s. The real focus of the presentation is on the slides, and this is not intended to be a full biography. So very, very glad to have you all with us. And I'm going to launch right in just with a very brief 2 slides to introduce us to this man. He really is, I think, one of the most unusual personalities in the history of the church. He was not only a UU minister, Unitarian minister, and then UU for more than 3 decades, but he was also a photographer, he was a journalist, he was a world traveler, and he was for several years a professional magician. And in fact, one of the interesting facts about him is that when our church called him, a contract provision mandated that he not practice magic within 100 miles of Belmont, Massachusetts. So this is a very unusual guy. You have a picture of him there on the left in the 1930s and on the right later in life. But I think when he was with us, I think that the crayon drawing was probably done while he was with First Church in Boston. I don't think that was done in Belmont. But in any event, Ed, if you could jump forward a slide, I'll just do a very quick timeline of Booth's life. Born in 1912, his parents were both immigrants from England. His father was a Unitarian minister first in Bar Harbor and then in Waterville, Maine. Then they were at the Elliott Church out in Natick. So he grew up not far nearby, but when he was a teenager, they moved to Canada. He spent his teenage years in Ontario, went to McMaster University, and then had this stint of time when he served as a professional magician. One of the very interesting stories of his life is that in the 1930s, he was recruited to practice magic on a cruise ship that circumnavigated the continent of South America. And for several weeks, he was on this ship. He writes in his autobiography, living like a millionaire. And all he had to do was 5 times during the course of this trip over several weeks, practice a 10-minute magic show. And on this trip to boot, he met the woman he later married and was his wife for 41 years. So a very interesting youth. But he then decided in the late 1930s that he really was called to the ministry. I'm going to read a little bit from his autobiography. I think John Nicholls Booth was, I might say, the master of the humble brag, but he was a little light on the humble. I think this was a man of panache and daring do and a lot of self-confidence. And I'm just going to read a passage from his autobiography. Much against my wishes or control, when I decided to enter the Meadville Theological School in Chicago in 1940, an account of it filled all of Newsweek magazine's religion column. It was front page in the Chicago Daily News and reported in newspapers from coast to coast. Why? At age 27, I was surrendering the occupation of a prominent, skilled professional magician for the probable relative oblivion and uncertain remuneration of the ministry. This was considered news. So that's kind of the tone of his autobiography, which is a wonderful piece that he wrote when he was 88 years old. He went into the ministry, served for, as I said, more than 3 decades at 4 churches. Ours was the second after his Evanston church. He was with us for 8 years. He was initially called on an interim basis. I think he saw Belmont as a very prestigious assignment, and he got in ostensibly for a period of a few months, but he made quite a hit and was asked to serve as our settled minister for the next 7 years or so. After he left Belmont, a year later, he was called to the Second Church of Boston. That's that magnificent Ralph Adams Cram sort of Georgian-style building at Audubon Circle that we saw a month or so ago in the slideshow I did about former Unitarian churches. It's now Ruggles Baptist Church. Second Church merged with First Church of Boston about 7 or 8 years after he left, but he was there for a number of years, then went out to California, where he spent the rest of his life. Not only was he a minister, but he was traveled widely on the lecture circuit, even internationally. Even during his time in Belmont, in summers, he would go overseas. He would go to Africa, Asia. One summer, he told the board, oh, by the way, I'll be on a cruise in New Zealand and Australia and the South Pacific with my wife and daughter after school. So he led quite an active life, published a great many books, hundreds of articles. One of the poignant things I've found in the archives is he actually wrote a letter at the end of his life, when he was in his mid to late 90s, noting that he didn't expect to live long and wondering whether he might have his memorial service at the First Church in Belmont. So I think he had soft feelings for our church. I don't know if that letter was received, was acknowledged when it came in. Doris, I don't know if that might be something that rings any bell with you, but I did come across it in the archives. It turns out his memorial service was held in Long Beach in '09, but he did make a trip back to Belmont. Some of you may remember in 1990 for the centennial that was organized largely by Smoke Twitchell, and he stayed with Smoke and Dave Twitchell in Belmont 34 years ago, would be, I think, the last time that he was with us. So that's basically the overview of his life. So I really, I thought I would just launch right into the slide deck that he left. This was a box of about 50, 55 slides. A handful are missing, and I am going to basically read verbatim from the script that he prepared to guide this presentation, with a small number, maybe 6 or 8 footnotes as we go. So Ed, with that as a background, why don't we move to the next slide? So hear the voice of John Nicholls Booth. On February 5th, 1856, 98 years ago, our church, the First Church in Belmont, Massachusetts, was founded. For many generations, its tower and clock have been a landmark in central Belmont. Okay, we can jump ahead. The first building stood across the street from the present location, where the post office building is situated. In 1890, the tall, spired structure was swept by flames. The new edifice was our present building. Okay, Ed, you can go ahead. Our church came into being 2 years before Belmont itself was incorporated. When the high school was organized in 1867, it held its first classes for some months in the basement of the First Church building, located across Concord Avenue. The town library was also first maintained in our church. Okay, we can go ahead. In 1923, this parish house was added. Almost unique among local churches, we have thrown open our facilities as a public service for meetings of all worthwhile organizations. Okay, next slide. Our wayside pulpit keeps passersby informed of the message this church is proclaiming. Mr. David Reed, our loyal and hardworking sexton, keeps our building in all its phases in A1 condition. Okay, we're going to go ahead. And a little footnote here, there is a missing slide, so I'm aligning 2 descriptions. Let us enter the church one Sunday morning. The ushers greet us beneath the flag, showing the many young men and women of our church who recently served in the armed forces. The eye travels to the focal point of the church sanctuary, the solid oak altar table. Lifting our eyes upward, we see a memorial window made by Tiffany of New York. Okay, we can go ahead. Nearly 1,500 pieces of pure glass make up this beautiful window, which portrays an angel cheering a weary pilgrim at nightfall, with the assurance that the rocky path of life leads to eternal day. Okay, the next slide. The first church is located in one of America's largest metropolitan areas with great universities at its doorstep. Many distinguished ministers have occupied its pulpit as guests. These include Edward Everett Hale, Paul Revere Frothingham, and Francis Greenwood Peabody. Next slide. 6 fine stained glass windows at the back of the church are worthy of your examination. One shows the Sistine Madonna up in the balcony center wall. This window is of opal and Venetian glass with Romanesque borders. Next slide. We like to think of our church as one big happy family to which new members are being warmly added all the time. These young people were ushering at a reception for your present minister in 1949. Mrs. Edwin E. Farnham and the late Mrs. Franklin Knapp poured the tea on that pleasant occasion, while a bevy of attractive ladies dispensed sandwiches. Okay, we can go on. In the receiving line were the Bronsons, the Chafees, and the Booths. You can see him there in the center, just as a footnote, all still bearing up nobly on the firing line, I mean the receiving line. Mr. Bronson was then chairman of the parish committee, with Mr. Chafee taking up the duties a few months later. Okay. Now, just a little footnote, pardon the line in this slide. I wanted to try to show the depth of the slide didn't allow me to get the full picture. If I focused either on the front or the back, it was either too washed out or too dark. So that's the reason I split it like this. Next to the worship services, the second most widely attended activity in our church is our church school. At 9:15 each Sunday morning, a full worship service led by the Minister of Religious Education is held. In a beautiful short service with full music by our junior choir under Miss Dawes, Lois Ann Dawes, and the organ played by Mr. Moffat, the children worship for 30 minutes before recessing to their classes. Next slide. Children enrolled in the junior choir learn the art of music during the Saturday morning rehearsals. They sing annually in Boston at the Unitarian Choir Festival and at special Easter and Christmas church services. Next slide. The Sunday school itself comprises 11 different classes and therefore requires quite a teaching staff. This is a preliminary combination period at 11 a.m. for the nursery, kindergarten, and grade 1. Next slide. Miss Baker, Miss Keller, and Miss Lewis are letting the children work off excess energy, balancing blocks on their heads and pulling pigtails before serious reading begins. Next slide. Now we're back at the 9:15 period again and visiting the second and third grades opening worship period led by Mrs. Baker and Miss White. What a wonderful group of youngsters you will see in these pictures. Next slide. The second and third grades are learning about values in the family and the community. Lessons are leading toward an understanding of the presence of a basic power in this world, supporting life, ethics, and morals. Next slide, Ed. Mrs. Morrissey is teaching her 4th grade class the background and richness of the Bible to increase their understanding of this great book. Illustrative materials are introduced into all these classes. Next slide. Mrs. Shaw's fifth grade meets on the stage of the parish hall. It is studying the three major religious faiths in America. I imagine, footnote, that means Protestantism, Catholicism, and Judaism. Their ideas of God, prayer, worship, and the social implications of religion itself. Next slide. Mr. Lewis, teacher of the sixth grade, is teaching the life of Moses and the development of the idea of monotheism, or one God, under the Egyptian pharaoh Amenhotep, or Akhenaten. Notice what handsome men and beautiful women we have for teachers. Next slide. Grade 7 meets in the religious education office under Mr. Richardson. Notice the happy atmosphere as the boys and girls study the life of Jesus and the parables of the great Nazarene using the famous Sophia Fah's book as text. Next slide. Grade 8 is seen being taught by Mr. Loomis of the Belmont Hill School. A footnote here, I actually tracked down a picture of Mr. Loomis playing football at Belmont Hill in the late 30s. That's how I identified him in this slide. His course on prejudice ended January 1st, and now Dr. Dexter, famed as the founder of the Unitarian Service Committee, is teaching a course to the class on war and peace. This represents a new advance in curriculum materials. Okay, we can go ahead. Miss Dawes, director of the junior choir and Christmas pageant, leads the 9th grade. It is studying various Protestant faiths of the world, noting their history, their beliefs, and their good works. Okay, we can go on. Professor Morrissey, this is Kermit Morrissey, who was an officer, one of the senior people at UMass Boston. Professor Morrissey leads the high school division in a study this year of the history of Unitarianism. Last year, he taught the basic beliefs of liberalism, and the previous year, a complete course in the major faiths of the world. Okay, Ed. The brand new Beacon curriculum taught here is being used by some of America's largest non-Unitarian churches, although it is a Unitarian development. These include Reverend Harry Emerson Fosdick's Riverside Church in New York, the Great First Methodist Church in Evanston, Illinois, and others. Experts of many faiths comprise the editorial board of educators responsible for this curriculum. Okay, next slide. Once each month, a Sunday school board meeting is held. One representative of each class goes to it to iron out problems and gain suggestions from the young people themselves. I urge any person interested in young people, interested in guiding them, to look into the possibility of getting on our teaching staff. It is a privilege and it is very rewarding. And next slide. The Women's Alliance is a bulwark of our church. Its 115 members gather monthly to hear diverse speakers, increase their sense of fellowship, and quicken the lifeblood of the church. The annual Christmas luncheon is a very pleasant affair. Okay, every luncheon has its head table, and the ladies decorate theirs very tastefully. Their programs this year include speakers on the Middle East, cerebral palsy, the hearts of mammals, the Arctic, and the problems of the Navajo Indians. That is to say, Dr. Booth, I am sorry we haven't a picture of the monthly Wednesday evening club for ladies unable to attend the Alliance. But we do have the weekly Emma L. Adams Lend a Hand Red Cross unit, folding tens of thousands of bandages and doing hundreds of sewed goods. Ordinarily, twice the number work in the parish house every single week. Next slide. Our high school age young people meet bi-monthly in the Channing Club. Meetings with other Unitarian clubs come in between. Miss Dawes is their advisor. So that's the same Miss Dawes who is the junior choir leader. Some of our young people are officers in regional organizations of the AUY, or Association of Unitarian Youth. Next slide. For junior high age young people, we have the Parker Club, named for Theodore Parker, the great Unitarian preacher. Various parents act as counselors at the bi-monthly meetings. Meeting under church auspices with wholesome companions, these clubs are fine character-building tools. And the next slide, this is my footnote from John Howe, to note that in this picture, we're looking at Dr. Booth, and in case you didn't recognize that smile, holding her dog here is 12-year-old Dorothy Stoneman, who today, to my knowledge, is the only living link to the First Church of 1954. Okay, Ed, we can go on. Now, a further footnote that unfortunately we're missing a couple of other slides related to the men's club, which met monthly. There was a missing image showing Messrs. Schwab, Tillinghast, and Shaw preparing one of the after-church dinners. That would be a midday meal on a Sunday out in the kitchen. The men find much fellowship serving these meals. The church service is over, and the crowd is beginning to gather for dinner. Along with our regular coffee hours, these dinners help newcomers to become better acquainted with the old-timers. People look about for the minister and await his blessing so that everyone can be seated. Okay, we can go on. Finally, dinner is served, and it's roast beef. The big Unitarian family is seated. As we grow and as more people worship with us, sit down to dinner with us, attend our clubs and functions with us, we have a growing sense of the richness of meeting with like-minded people to search out the higher values and meanings of life together. Okay, now the next slide. The minister's study is part of the heart of the church. Here, young and old come to discuss their problems. Here, the program of the church, so much larger than most people ever dream, is guided. Here, administrative details are developed and carried out. Okay. The Reverend Ralph L. Hurtle was the first of 3 fine ministers of religious education to serve to date. That is a footnote during Booth's ministry. He now holds a Unitarian ministerial fellowship. As soon as pictures of our distinguished ministers emeritus, Doctors Henry Wilder Foote and Marion Franklin Ham, can be secured, they will be added to this series. Okay, and if we jump to the next slide, this is just a footnote. I've added this picture, which many of you will recognize. The picture of these 3, so that's Foote in the upper left, and Marion Franklin Ham below, and Booth in the upper right. This picture was taken in connection with the probably in late 1955, and it was unveiled at the 1956 centennial celebration. It's the only contemporaneous image that I've added to this slide set. Okay, we can go on, Ed. Ours is a congregational polity church. That is, and this is footnote, this is an interesting twist. Ultimate authority for all policies is held by the parish committee as representatives of the congregation. Meeting monthly, its members are democratically chosen by the church members. Next slide. The finance committee carries major responsibilities. Our program requires a budget of almost $22,000 a year to maintain. Raising this money, keeping careful records of every cent spent and received from hundreds of sources, requires able and constant administration. Mr. Gordon Smith is our treasurer. Mr. Robert Rhines is our every member canvas director. And next slide. Supervising the upkeep of an edifice as valuable as ours, with its many rooms, its innumerable meetings and activities, requires long labor and devotion. Mr. David Reed keeps up our plant in its fine condition. He is known as the leading coffee maker of Belmont, and we show him engaged in a typical activity. So you coffee aficionados, Belmont was probably not the greatest place in those days. Anyway, we'll go on to the next slide. I have, this is a blank because there are 2 missing slides here. I am going to read the text, it's important. Few people realize the amount of paperwork entailed in running a church like ours. Mrs. Jones, the minister's secretary, efficiently keeps up with the mailings, correspondence, printing, records, and other details that come in each day for attention. And every Wednesday morning, Mrs. Dawes and Mrs. Nagel spend several hours folding and stamping the weekly Unitarian newsletter that comes to you each Thursday. This is symbolic of the countless labors of love being performed quietly and often unnoticed to make the program function smoothly. So, John Howe here, I'm just sorry that we're missing those two slides. It'd be good to know more about those people. Okay, we'll go on. We got a handful more. The Committee on Religious Education meets periodically with the ministers to discuss curriculum problems and changes, arrange parent-teacher meetings, and discuss ways and means of making our Sunday school program effective and more vigorous. Nothing is left to chance. And when I did go to Dorothy to get her input and see if she knew much about who was on, that's how I identified her. And she tells me her mother is seated just to the right of center. That's Dorothy's mother, Stoneman. So we'll go to the next slide. And we are missing one picture from the parlor, but I elided the description. If you were to drop in late into the ladies' parlor any Sunday morning at 10 o'clock, you would see our church choir in its weekly rehearsal, made up of Unitarians who love to sing, supplemented by 4 professional voices. Now, on this slide, during the church service itself, the balcony and choir look like this. Mr. Moffat, our organist and choir master, is seated at the console of a 2,500 pipe Cassavant organ, one of the finest of its kind in Greater Boston. Additions to the choir are always warmly welcomed. Next slide. This is Dr. Hideo Kishimoto, famed professor of the Tokyo Imperial University. He spoke at a church service 4 years ago, and he is representative of the various guest preachers who periodically share our pulpit. And I'll just add a footnote that Kishimoto was a Unitarian. He was educated at Harvard, and he was a leading scholar in Japan in the comparative study of religions, which is a field of study that took root in Japan at the very end of the 19th century. So this is within 50 years of when it began. His father had also been a Unitarian minister. Now, the next slide. The church fair in the fall and the nativity pageant at Christmas are probably the 2 biggest special events in our church year. Dawes Hall is filled with makeup tables, pageants, pageant producers, and the cast itself as excitement mounts in the 3 hours before the pageant starts. There are a handful of pictures, some were not in the final slideshow, that show Dawes Hall before the renovation, which was done. I know there was several on the Zoom call here probably remember the church before the renovation in the 80s, and it used to be a rather bleak, dark, and dank place with these brick pillars, and there were little classroom areas carved off into different corners of Dawes Hall. So not all of the pictures made it into his final cut. Next slide, please. Upstairs, the pageant begins with carols from the junior choir. Every seat in church is filled, as well as some or all of the balcony. This is the 25th consecutive year for this lovely production, written by Dr. Henry Wilder Foote, minister of our church from 1924 to 1940, and now our honored minister emeritus. And I showed this to Dorothy, and she actually was a member in this choir. Next slide. The pageant has begun to a background of soft organ music, occasional solos, and the measured narration of Dr. Foote and Mr. Dixon. Special lighting, which flash photography cannot reveal, increases the loveliness of the settings. Okay, the next slide. You can't really see her face, but we saw her face in an earlier picture. Miss Lois Ann Dawes has produced and directed this Christmas presentation with great success for the past 5 years. Many grown-ups today can remember when they began in the cast as little angels. A favored few rose to become Mary, Gabriel, or some other star in the program. And now we'll go to the next and final slide. And thus does the varied, wholesome spiritual and daily life of the First Church in Belmont go on year after year, now approaching the century mark. No one can say how many thousands upon thousands of people have found their days made brighter and their outlook stronger because of this important aspect of their life. This is our church. Are we going to rest in inglorious ease or be consumed with self-satisfaction over our inheritance? Or are we going to use the open door of opportunity it sets before us to support it proudly, to take on tasks willingly, to make its work more effective, and to introduce our faith and our church to our neighbors so that others too may share in the joy and strength that our church has brought to us? Well, we can end the screen share. That's the that's the slide set. I appreciate your help on that, Ed. I felt like this was a real treasure, and there are some obvious differences between the first church 70 years ago and the first church today. Most striking, of course, we were lily white. It was, you noticed the dress and costume of the day was certainly different. A tremendous amount of involvement in the church. And I think one of the other big differences is there probably wasn't the scourge of all weekend sports, so that people had time to spend on church activities. It was a very active place. And I think he was quite an interesting leader to have at the time. So I'd be interested in hearing folks' reactions. Why don't we go off mute, Lillian, and see what other reactions other people on the call had. And then I did share some other materials from Booth that I hope you may have had a chance to look at, because he's not only, you know, he was a photographer, he was a performer, he was a producer, he was a cinematographer, but he also was a very wide-ranging preacher. He talked about all kinds of subjects. He talked about nuclear war. He talked about decolonization in Africa. He talked about the challenges in East Asia. So a photographer, a personality, a performer. A question I have is, did people in our church regard him as a pastor? And the reality is, not long after this presentation in 1956, there was a friction point, and ultimately there were some pushing for him to leave. He ultimately decided to leave. And I think a lot of the friction arose over the fact that he was such a personality. I mean, he'd be called away to go to, you know, give presentations in Canada. One time he went to Dallas to talk about decolonization in Africa. There was an episode in January of 1956 where he literally went away for 2 weeks and nobody at church knew where he was. This is in the parish committee notes. And this was like 3 weeks before the centennial celebration. So I think he was a great asset. There are people in the church and there are people around the country that said John Nicholls Booth was the greatest advertisement for Unitarianism. But there are people that were in our church that felt he was maybe not all here in terms of his focus and attention. So it was a mixed bag. But I got to say, I think this man was one of the most interesting people that we've had in our pulpit or in our congregation in our 170 odd year history.
Yeah, I see Kathy shaking her head. Why don't we all unmute? I think then you can have a conversation and maybe give your impressions. I think everybody's going to have a different point of view on this. But Kathy, maybe you want to start? to talk about this? What are your feelings or
I
impressions?
thought it was an utterly delightful cut of the time and perfectly done. John, thank you so much, because I didn't know that period. I was young, I was probably, when he was doing it, I was a teenager, and so I didn't know him, but I knew his name. Everyone knew that name. All my peers wouldn't know that name after I joined the Unitarians.
Yeah.
So I think that was an exquisite doing, and thank you very much. It's not just a cut of him, it's a cut of the entire radius of happenings, from lay people to children to all the way through. The fact that he went through every single class, and how different they were, how serious they were.
Yeah.
But they didn't look like they were plagued by having to go to school. The looks in all those slides of the young people were attentive but not heavy, not, you just felt there was an atmosphere. Maybe it was just the slides, but it was an atmosphere of being in the place you wanted to be. That was wonderful.
Yeah, John, to reiterate what Kathy said, to thank you for reviving this wonderful view of this. I was a little kid in 1954, and it was just so wonderful to sort of get the aroma, if you will, of that period revived for our present consideration. So thank you so much for all of your work as our number one historian, and for specifically for bringing some of the contents of our marvelous church archives to life again, to understand who we were, and to enable us to think about the differences between who we were and who we are today. One other thing about John Nicholls Booth that I've always sort of celebrated him for was that that period was just at the tail end of the McCarthy era.
Yeah.
And one of our there was an MIT mathematician, a very famous guy named Dirk Struik, who joined the Dutch Communist Party when he was 19, and he remained a member of the Communist Party of the Netherlands until the day he died. When he was asked what the secrets of his longevity were, because he lived to well over 100, as with all his faculties, he said, well, they're actually the 3 M's. There was mathematics, marriage, and Marxism, maybe not quite in that order. But the point was that Struik was ostracized in Belmont and in the church because of the fact that for him, Joseph Stalin was perfectly fine, which was, of course, not the case for about everybody else in the church. And there was a movement to ostracize Struik. And one of John Nicholls Booth's, I think, real moral accomplishments was he made a special point to make Struik feel like he was part of the community and welcome at a time when everybody else thought he was a monster, basically. Just an interesting tidbit about him.
Yeah, Jim?
Yeah.
Oh, well done, John. It was great. Just 2 comments. The first one is his first church was in Evanston, Illinois. My parents met in Evanston, Illinois, and about 1940, and I was born on January 24th, 1942, and I was living in Chicago at that time. And the other thing to comment is that when we had our 150th anniversary in 2006, I had sent emails or even letters out to everyone, former staff, and he responded and wrote a letter that I have shared with the team before, which is just wonderful. And maybe one more comment is that he is convinced and has written a lot about the fact that he thinks that John Deere's lights were from the second church in Boston. So.
Yeah, that's a important point. What Jim's talking about is we all think, 1 if by land, 2 if by sea. that those lanterns were hung at Christ Church in the North End. But in fact, it was John Nicholls Booth who first did the detailed research and has made the case that it was the old Second Church of Boston, which was actually torn down and used by the British for firewood. That was the building probably a couple of blocks away from the Christ Episcopal Church, that was where it was known to be kind of a den for the insurrectionists at that time, the colonials or the patriots or whatever. And so the British made it a target. So there's no surviving trace. The Second Church was then rebuilt, and that actually became Ralph Waldo Emerson's pulpit for a short period of time. As you may know, Emerson left the ministry in part because he disagreed with his parishioners over the practice of celebrating communion in a Unitarian church. And a couple of hundred years later, or 150 years later, it was John Nicholls Booth at that Audubon Circle Church who discontinued the practice of celebrating communion and proposed the sale of 5 ancient pieces of silver to help replenish the church's budget. Caused some controversy, and it didn't ultimately save the church from merging with First Church, but it was his way to try to keep up with the times. And so his connection with that historic Second Church is a deep one. Did you all see those brochures that were attached? One was the a guide to the First Church or to Unitarianism for young people, which I thought did quite a good job. And I think it would be good to resurrect and maybe share something like that. I did share it with our young people in the youth group when I was a mentor 3 or 4 years ago. And the other one, there is a brochure. It was in the early 40s. So this would have been during the war. And Booth had just come out of seminary. And he felt that there was not a good contemporary, I'll use it in the theological sense, apology, a good case for Unitarianism, kind of in the church literature. And so he wrote one that became, according to the expert John Nicholls Booth, the most widely published, something like, what did he say, 250,000 copies were printed or more. And it was actually republished as late as the 1980s. So he was a strong advocate for Unitarianism, but I would say it was a different spirit of Unitarianism. I think, it's, as I said in my note, it's muscular, it's male, it's masculine, it's individualistic as opposed to communitarian. So it's a different flavor, I think, from the direction the church has gone in recent decades. I think he also makes a strong emphasis on, he draws prestige to the church by citing to the number of prominent Americans who have been Unitarian, the presidents who have been Unitarian, the scientists, and so forth. So, actually during his time in, I think in Belmont, he conducted a series of, what would you call them? They were kind of like revival meetings for Unitarianism at King's Chapel in Boston. So, think Billy Graham would come to town and he would hold his tent revivals and people would come for several nights. Well, John Nicholls Booth made the case for Unitarianism right here in Boston. So he was an aggressive and very articulate proponent for the Unitarian tradition.
But that list, that's where I was offended, that it didn't include, there were no names of women at all. I mean, you'd think he would include Margaret Fuller, for God's sake, or, Clara Barton, or, there are people within our denomination, we know, women who have really contributed quite a bit, but for some reason, he just didn't see them. Jean?
I thought it was absolutely delightful to go through this, and I was just sort of secretly going, oh, that's the room that was next to the nursery school and the room behind the other room. And, I was just
I would say,
identifying, oh, and that was that other half of the parish hall where we used to meet. Yeah, so
yeah.
it was so great to kind of see the old rooms and imagine it. I was struck
Yeah.
by when you read, he's talked about the church school, and he said, and lessons, a presence of a basic power, the presence of a basic
Yeah.
power. And so his language was not, because I read very briefly the sermon on Christianity, and so he was not, he was using, this, different language. And I'm curious, when did the cross come down from the chancel? How is that timing with this? Because I'm also just wondering if were people looking for more churchy stuff, and was he not, Christian or Jesus enough for the time, or did he open the door for these other things to happen?
Gene, I don't know the exact date. And Jim, you may remember, I don't know if it was during Arthur Tripp, if the cross had come down by the time Gil Phillips arrived. I think it was during the ministry of Tripp. I know there's one advertisement for a Sunday service. You know how the Sunday services always used to be advertised in the paper, and you could actually, and sometimes you could find the sermon topic. And there was an Easter service in the late 50s or early 60s where Dr. Arthur Tripp will preach on the topic, does Easter make sense?
Yeah.
And so I think it was Tripp who made that call, and it did. We talked about this once or twice in the past. That did result in a minor stampede of people leaving the church.
Yeah, because I thought with the sermon that you posted, I was absolutely flabbergasted. This cheeky thing that he said. He's talking about Jesus, and he says his second coming was allegedly a signal from God that any who could follow him would eventually have their sins forgiven, their cares lifted, and thereby gain eternal salvation. What a cheap and easy way to solve life's overpowering problems.
Back to his treatment of women or what was happening in the church at the centennial in 1956, the booklet that describes it lists all the church members and all the women, and it's all the women are Mrs. the name of their husband.
Yeah. Yeah, and that didn't change really until the early 70s.
No, that's right.
Yeah, but I would say, Lillian, to your earlier question, the one thing I would not call John Nicholls Booth is he was not an enlightened feminist. He was a man of his times, and I mean I read this script for the first time, and I thought of. It took me back to when we watched Mad Men a few years ago, or when I grew up with my own father, for God's sake. I mean, it was a different time. It really was. So,
Yeah. Okay,
Kathy.
Bill better start talking about this, because that's what we're going to be focusing on, right?
Yeah.
Starting.
Kathy Lynn's waving her hand.
Well, I just wanted to say that I was born in 48. So by the time of this, I was heavily into Sunday school. I was raised Protestant, and Sunday, your comment about sports is just right on, because when I was growing up, Sunday was church. You went to Sunday school and you went to church, and there was stuff afterwards. The whole family did. It wasn't just that there wasn't hockey. Stores were closed, so you couldn't go anywhere or do anything. And that's why when I was looking at the suppers with all those people and the alliance with all those women members, and it was, church was the social fabric. And it almost, looking at the dress of the boys and their jackets and ties and haircuts, and the girls in their skirts and the women in their hats. And I mean, I used to wear gloves, and this was a Protestant church, and but it really brought all of the trappings of the time back, the way in which people sat at meetings. And, you know, going to college in the 60s really was a wonderful time to be in college when everything changed for us. But I do remember it brought back those feelings of those days in the mid-50s.
Well, you know, do folks remember the film of 10 or 20 years ago, Pleasantville, that starts in black
Oh,
and
yes.
white, and then it's the teenage coming of age story, and then when they fall in love, everything's color. It's kind of like the Wizard of Oz. But for me, looking at these pictures, it was the first time in the archives of the church where we go from black and white imagery to color. And to see the world suddenly come alive in color was fascinating for me, but it did feel like the before times as I looked at these pictures. I have dim memories. There was something reminiscent of my early childhood, which would have been in the early 60s, a little bit different. But anyway, it was quite something to come across this. Jim, had you seen those slides in the archives?
I don't think so, but
Yeah.
I'm older, so I mean, I entered high school in 1959, and but we came here in 79, and the women were still wearing hats. All the men wore ties.
All the women or the older women?
Most of the women, I think, still.
In 79, Jim?
Yeah.
I don't remember that. I don't remember that.
Okay, maybe it was just the older women.
Yeah.
But I stopped wearing a tie in maybe 8 or 9 years ago.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I know from First Parish in Concord that when I went there in 73, the women, there was always a pourer of tea, and at the coffee hour, you went through and you got your tea from a woman on either end with white gloves, and they poured for you. I mean, that was just the way it was.
Yeah.
I have to say, I will just say that I was very sad in a way, because what I was reflecting on was, I mean, I'd been at First Church for 12 years, and the vibrancy of having potluck suppers and gathering together just went away during the pandemic. And it's a sad thing, because trying to resurrect it now, I mean, people are eager to do it, but it's going to take, even for us who want to, a while before you get to that stage that we were before the pandemic.
Yeah. Lillian, I agree very much with that. As and over the past year, when I took that in-depth look at Henry Wilder Foote and the church during the Depression was a major setback. It was a real challenge, but it brought people together. And the threat of the pandemic was people were reluctant to be together. And churches, the church is the gathering of the people. That's the etymological root. And it has been, I think, perhaps the biggest challenge our church has faced, and how we forge those reconnections. And I know Chris still talks about it every Sunday, and it's vital that we still have to reintroduce ourselves. And I think we do need to get back to having suppers and so forth. I don't know what we do about the scourge of all sports all weekend. That's a challenge that all churches are facing. Where did I recently see an article about the de-churching of America? It's not just that people are cynical or skeptical about about the idea of faith, which I think ought to create an opening for a church like the UU Church. But it's that there's so many competing activities and demands, and people are so stressed in their personal lives. But it is clear to me, to I think the earlier discussion that I think it was Kathy, what you were saying, this was a time period where on Sunday morning and much of Sunday, people did put a number one priority on their church connection. And the church had something like 340 pledging units. Although, as I scour the parish committee notes, a great many of those pledging units are giving very nominal amounts, but still, it was much bigger than we are at present. So it was the baby boom, and I think when you have a huge number of children, I think we had the boomlet in the 90s, and that was a period where we saw attendance go up. And we're living in a time of great challenges, but we got to sustain our church in these difficult times. And I am confident and certainly hopeful that we'll see a time where the conditions really do bring us back together. But I think what I took away from this was a sense that it was a time period where people put top priority on this connection. And while it felt a little, it looks like a different time period from what we're in, and maybe the curriculum wouldn't have been exactly the same, but I think the spirit that suffused this church at that time is a spirit that I think we should strive to never lose.
It turns out there's a book just came out called The Great Dechurching by Jim Davis and Michael Graham.
That's what I was thinking of. I saw an article in the Atlantic, I think, about that. Yeah.
So, I mean, just sort of the bullet summary of this is we are currently experiencing the largest and fastest religious shift in U.S. history.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think actually that might be an interesting, whether it's in the history group, and maybe that is an interesting thing, a text for us to read, sort of from a historian's perspective. What is it that's brought this about, and how do we respond? Because that, after all, it's as I've told you a few times, and Jim, we talked about this early on. The reason we do this isn't just for the love of history. It's what can we learn from the past so that we can be a stronger church going forward. So maybe it would be good to have a discussion on that article and share it around.
Well, was there an article in the Atlantic about?
I think I can find it, or Bill, you might have it right at hand.
While you were talking, I used what our former president called the Google. So yeah. I just Googled dechurching in America, and the first thing that popped up was the Amazon ad for that book.
Yeah. Yeah.
But if I can find the Atlantic article, I'll send it out to everybody.
Yeah, that would be good.
Yeah, great.
And John, just so you know that the fellowship group that Lillian is spearheading, there is going to be another circle dinner coming up in March, and there's going to be a potluck in April. So, and we had this fantastic pizza and bingo last month.
Right, and there's Valentine card making.
So we're attempting each month to have something that brings us all together, as well as the soup lunches on Wednesday. We've had consistently 18 people every Wednesday for lunch, so it's been wonderful. Lorraine knows well. She made a great salad this week.
Yeah, and those are all in person. That's the point of it, is to get back to where, people are together in person, because we know we're using Zoom just right now, and there's an advantage to that because it's quick and it's easy, and you don't have to leave your home, but nothing takes the place of being in person. Because there's a tactical, there's a physical quality that can't be reproduced in Zoom. As good as we are, and as necessary as it is, it doesn't take the place of in-person. I
Yeah.
think we need to have both, but, you know,
Yeah.
we definitely need to come back from the pandemic.
Yeah.
For sure.
I see we might be losing Howard, but Doris, I wonder, we haven't heard too much from you. Do you remember John Nicholls Booth? Did you meet or see him much, either of you, Doris or Howard? Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, you need to press your space bar so that you can be heard.
I think she's logged in twice, and that's
Ah.
the issue.
Okay.
Hmm.
Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry, we can't
Mute.
hear. Oh,
Can you hear me
yes.
now?
Yeah.
Okay,
Hear you.
yeah.
Mhm.
No, I don't think either one of us did. But you know, I kept thinking about the issue of communion. And I remember when Howard and I were up in this little Rockport church, you know, very early in the early 80s, we had quite a wonderful group, and they were still serving communion. And every time we would begin that, you know, as Unitarian as we could, there was this one woman who stood up and she said, "I will not stay for this." And she turned around and she went out. And I thought, well, bless her heart, you know, there are some weekend. But what was the attitude of communion at the church in these early 70s and 80s? Did you still serve communion? Do you remember?
I don't ever remember. Did Victor ever do communion services? I know that I recall, did Eloise McGaw run communion services? Kathy, were you?
It was Easter weekend.
Yeah.
And
She-
on Good Friday and Easter weekend, on Saturday or Sunday. not Sunday,
So
but
there is an
one of those
opportunity.
they had communion service.
For people
First
who
it was
wanted.
Victor and then Eloise.
Yeah, but it was never within the
That's what I remember.
context.
It was in the parlor, I think.
In the
Yes.
parlor?
And
Yeah,
Eloise did
that's what I
something with
remember. I never attended, but-
washing of the hands and washing of the feet, which would have happened on the
Good Friday.
Seder.
The Thursday. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Well, that's interesting because I was just wondering how that moved from, was it ever a part of the service?
I
The
don't
Sunday morning
remember.
service?
I would think it must have been Doris at some point because there are all those little tiny.
Yeah,
I can picture that you put the little glass vials with the grape juice.
right. Yeah, I remember when I first came, I saw those and I thought, oh, you know, are you still doing that? No, I'm sure you weren't, but.
Well, we do have the old silver service from the first church, one of the few items that survived the fire.
Yeah,
And I'm sure in the 19th century, there was periodically would have been a communion service as a memorial, not as a sacrament. So
Well, I was in my head chuckling when we knew that he was a magician, but he wasn't allowed to practice magic. And I always thought that communion kind of represented that fine line.
A little, or
Yeah,
water,
right.
water into wine would do it.
yeah.
yeah,
enough.
suddenly it's the body yeah, right. That's great, man. But
Well,
anyway, thank you. That was a wonderful history, you know. It's such a blessing for the church to have historians, really is.
Yes, wonderful, John. And your enthusiasm and knowledge is.
Yeah, it's really terrific.
John,
Well,
I had a question for you.
yeah.
Did the contract that said he couldn't practice magic within 100 miles of the church also cover sorcery?
Yeah, but he didn't know. He would go around New England where he could make short trips. But it was quite striking as I've gone into I've been looking at there's so many great sources that we have. A year ago I was focused on the annual annual meeting reports, which really provide sort of a 1-year snapshot. I'm now looking at the actual parish committee minutes of monthly meetings. And I know, Jim, I'm not sure, is Jim still on?
Not on the call anymore, no.
No.
Yeah, Jim has counseled me that the place to really take the pulse of the church is in the Unitarians. And so my intention over time is to develop a digital record of all the old paper Unitarians, which started in the late 1940s. And then we got to make sure that we're capturing all, these days, so much goes out electronically. So I got to work with Tracy to make sure that everything that's been produced in the last 10 years doesn't get lost, so that we can capture it for the archives. But the monthly meetings are presenting an interesting picture of some of the. That's where you learn about some of the tensions that don't come out in the annual meetings that are for broad public consumption.